Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I'm delighted, as usual, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to talk to you today about 1975's The Rocky Horror Picture Show!
Yay!
Yay, indeed.
And this was Anthony's choice,
It
which
was.
I think will become clearer as the episode proceeds, because I think that his enthusiasm will just gush forth. It's not that I didn't want to or wasn't willing to talk about it, but shameful secret time.
Ooh.
This was the first time I had seen Rocky Horror.
Dun dun! Oh my gosh, the horror scholar admits
I know.
on air. We've got you. We've got you.
I
You're
know.
gonna have to turn your degree back in, I think.
I know. That is how it works. That is 100% how it works.
If you find out that a horror scholar hasn't seen a horror text that you have seen and you know it, you get their degree, actually.
Yes.
So
Yes.
on air, I have actually just
So welcome,
transferred the
Dr.
degree.
Anthony Tresca.
Hello, hello.
I had seen the staged production once, but it's only been in the last couple of years because it was living here in San Antonio.
And what do you mean by stage production? Did you see a shadow cast or did you see like a production of the staged musical?
I saw a play.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Yeah. So I saw a play first. I saw it pre-pandemic, but maybe it may have been as soon as like that October before the pandemic. So it's still not been very long. So I am a new babe to Rocky Horror, as opposed to you, which we did the math. You have seen it, engaged with it, participated in it more times this year than I have in my entire life. Is that correct?
That's correct. By today, and we're recording this on October 24th, so just a little before we release it. And by this time, and I'm not including, I'm still going to be seeing Rocky 2 more times this October cycle. I've already seen it 7 times this year. And that's either watched it at home or gone out and seen it at like there's COVID safe Rocky productions that are kind of happening right now. And so I've gone and seen it in those capacities.
I know there are films I've seen, period, that many times.
Yeah.
But I am struggling. Like, that's a lot. So this is why I wasn't sure, because I just was like, I haven't seen it before, so who knows? But I can guarantee you I'm probably not going to be the fan that you are. And I did enjoy it very much so.
And that is okay. There's not one unanimous experience with Rocky. Everyone is welcome here in the Rock. That's kind of part of the appeal of the original stage musical, and the appeal in particular of how Rocky has been appropriated through the midnight screenings and the shadow casts. And
do you know that was actually the hardest part about seeing it for the first time?
Yeah.
With an audience, because they knew all of the call and response moments. They, had an idea of what to do, and it was very, very clear that I was probably the only person in that audience, and it was not a very big audience either.
Yeah.
But I was the only person in the audience that hadn't seen it before. Or if there was one other, it was like one of the cast members' grandparents, and even then they'd probably seen it. So it does create for a very, not intentionally, but a little bit of an alienating effect, because it truly is a cult classic in a way that I think we can't really apply that label as much to any other film that doesn't have this, like you say, the shadow casting and all of that. Like, this is just a very, very unique experience.
And that leads me into our first subversion and transgression of the episode. I will be introducing a theory today. I guess because I have run your degree earlier in the episode, that means now I am in charge of presenting the academic scholarship. And we're going to be talking particularly about that feeling and why, particularly for newcomers into Rocky, there is that kind of weird alienation that is intrinsically built into the experience because as scholar, how am I doing, by the way? I'm introducing scholarship. Is it good?
You're doing
good?
Fantastic.
Oh my
gosh. Yeah, good. Yeah, it's like you did earn that PhD and went through the misery, pain, and trauma, in the few minutes that it took for you to consume my...
It's good to know that trauma is transferable.
Yes, these are the lessons we are wanting to share.
So, as John Lynskey said in his essay, Queer Cult Performance, Recreating Rocky Horror in the 21st Century, he talks exclusively about kind of this concept of transgression, and he defines transgression as a concept involving going against an established code of conduct or to go beyond the bounds of an aesthetic, ethical, or established form of behavior. He defines this as obviously this is entirely what Rocky is about. The entire the narrative is all about transgression, and these characters of Brad and Janet, who are kind of your everyman characters, being forced to undergo this massive change. But Chris Jenkins, who he's taking part of his theory about transgression and weaving it in here, says that transgression is a conduct which breaks rules or exceeds boundaries. However, the transgressive behavior does not deny those boundaries, but rather exceeds them and thus completes them. Transgression is not disorder, but instead reminds us of the necessity of order. And so this is why in cult films, these kinds of liminal experiences that you have where you are temporarily away from order, it's not a lack of order, it's not completely chaos, it's a new order. And Lynskey argues that this engagement of Rocky, in particular by queer audiences, is similar to Carnival and consists of human relations, and it's the experience of watching a film in a safe, non-judgmental space with other queer people allows for the suspension of order imposed at other times. This participatory screening acts as a space for the other, where one who may be subject to discrimination and marginalization by a heteronormative society are free to express a certain queer identity and disengage the marginalization through these transgressive acts.
Okay, so let's break that down
Let's break it down. Yeah, let's discuss that. Yeah, what did you... Immediate reactions to Lynskey.
There are a couple of things that I think are emerging in this that are really important to keep in mind, and they're all things we've talked about to varying degrees in a lot of our discussions of things, that particularly anything that falls into camp, and that is that there is something about the space in this moment, this liminal moment of engaging with either the film or is it shadow cast or shadow play?
It's called shadow cast, and the shadow cast okay. For anyone who is a Rocky virgin out there, the shadow cast is the experience of when you have a separate group of performers who are performing in front of the film, the 1975 film version of Rocky Horror, and they're recreating it up there, usually with their own inventive staging and twists and gags that they throw in conjunction with the film.
Perfect. So whether you're seeing the play, the shadow cast, or the film, it is a experience that is bounded, right? It's bounded in time, it's bounded in place. But part of what's being argued here is that it also manages to transcend that because anything that is transversive or transgressive is going to be pushing beyond, is what I'm hearing, right? It's not saying there are no rules, it is utter chaos. It is saying here are the rules, we laugh at the rules as we go beyond the rules. And I think you can see all of that in either the experiential moments of the film or in the text itself. So that makes perfect sense to me, and I think that it aligns completely with how the film sets it up, because like you said, we have the everyman characters and they are pushed beyond, right? But the boundaries are still presented. They're just, we go past them.
And I think in particular because who it's been predominantly appropriated by, these screenings and spaces, it is pushing beyond that established order to temporarily create a better order that is more accepting of, in particular, those types of people whose society has not been as accepting of. So it's a new order for a specific good, but it also, like the film itself, acknowledges that that order is temporary and it's in that moment. It's like Frank at the end of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, has to be ended. It has to go away. And so there is something really ephemeral and liminal about this space, which is why Lynskey makes that argument that screening is a space for the other, which is not something we usually talk about as the other being representative of an event, but it's usually more of others as groups of people or and other marginalized groups, but it's rare that term is applied to an event.
I think it is a very compelling and interesting argument. I would push back a little on the idea that it's, and I know this isn't quite what you were saying, but you talked about it being this like new thing, but in many ways this is a very familiar, like several hundred years familiar framework, because it's very akin to Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. It would not be hard at all, right? And your nodding indicates that clearly I'm not alone in this. Clearly you are not alone in thinking this. That this is, Midsummer Night's Dream, just even more blatantly queer, and instead of fantasy, science fiction.
Yeah, both director Jim Sharman, who directed the 1975 film and helped with the original musical, as well as writer and actor Richard O'Brien, have both talked about how it's a fairy tale. That is what this is. It is a dark fairy tale. It's Hansel and Gretel with sex and rock and roll, as it were. And that's a direct quote from Jim Sharman from a 2010 interview with Media Mike. So yeah, I think that twisted fairy tale labeled like Midsummer Night's Dream is a perfect way to think about this.
And you could even argue that for various reasons, Midsummer Night's Dream manages to be a little bit more transgressive in one respect than Rocky Horror, because at the end, Brad and Janet are back together. They may not stay together, but they're back together. Whereas in Midsummer Night's Dream, the world that the fairy tale world that they experience has left a permanent mark. Whereas you're absolutely correct that in Rocky Horror, we are left with the but don't worry, dear gentle heteronormative folks, because at the end of the day, we can return back to that, and it's been this dreamlike condition. So I would argue in that one respect, we might even have some earlier, more transgressive texts, but they're not transgressive, queer transgressive, right? We also have just an incredible amount of scholarship that is out there on Rocky Horror.
Yeah.
In an effort to reclaim my PhD, I just want to show the mere spectrum of things that emerged. So Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, he has an edited collection that came out in 2008 called Reading Rocky Horror, the Rocky Horror Picture Show and Popular Culture. And this was the first book-length project to delve into Rocky. So one of the articles is about looking at the ways that Rocky Horror incorporates, appropriates, and cannibalizes elements of the science fiction tradition, which of course is very neatly set up in that initial song, as well as in many of the scenes throughout the film. The author of this particular article argues that what Rocky Horror reveals is that we are what we fear most. Another article is looking particularly at the musical, how it has been influenced by glam rock. We have another one which is looking specifically at how the film borrows self-consciously departs from the conventions of the standard Hollywood musical. Then we have another article looking at viewership practices, how spectorial identification works in terms of the fetishization of interruption rather than suturing meaning, and how Rocky Horror fans break the diegetic flow and therefore foreground both its rigidity and failure of dialogue. There's another one that's looking at psychoanalytical theories of viewership and the idea of misrecognition or recognition. Another one is looking at the ways in which the film's eroticism generates audience response. And this author is trying to answer the question, why Rocky Horror? What is it about this film? And his answer is that it's the sincerity of its lust, which I think is an intriguing argument. Then there are articles talking about the competing progressive and conservative messaging in the film.
This is just one book,
Many. Yes, and so if you can dream it, it can be, I think, a framework for reading this film.
Yeah, Rocky Horror is truly just a unique cultural artifact. And so I think we could absolutely try to, like, talk to death the, like, nitty-gritties of all of that. But I think it's also just interesting to talk about the cultural effect of it and then our, like, kind of unique experiences with it. Trying to, because that's all of what Rocky is. As we introduced in there's always going to be some level of alienation because the call outs and the experience of it and who you see it with is all totally dependent on the group and that collective psyche of the group, which can be totally different. One Rocky Horror showing with one crowd, you may know all the call outs. One Rocky Horror showing, maybe doing it on a totally different call outs things. And so I think that is what is so much fun about Rocky.
One of the things that I stress when teaching film studies more generally is that we need to be careful about articulating the difference between effect and affect. So we can't say that a particular camera angle or shot type or whatever it might be will for sure engender a specific effect on audiences, because that just implies and assumes a whole lot. So instead we can talk about the affect with an A, and so we can say this is the intended affect. Whether or not you experience it is a slightly different issue altogether. And I think what you said is so smart, because what you're saying is that Rocky Horror allows us to realize such an incredible truth about any text, and that is that the text itself may be stationary, it may be unchanging, but our experiences with the text imbue it with life perpetually. Mm-hmm. And when we view it, how we view it, with whom we view it, is going to change the text every single time in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, like, really magical things about Rocky that, ironically, I don't think I got when I first was introduced to Rocky, because I experienced Rocky like many people who were children of the 2000s. I've heard from many other people in my particular age group that they also experienced it in the Rocky Horror Glee show that came out in 2010, season 2, episode 5 of Glee, which was if you've never seen Glee, which I don't recommend now. It's not one of Ryan Murphy's even better works. Go watch season 3 of American Horror Story if you want to watch Ryan Murphy. But this episode single-handedly I loved the music. I think I was just so compelled, even by this watered down version, by that rock and roll aesthetic that Richard O'Brien's music forces into it. And I think that's one of the more interesting things about it is a rock musical, like 2 decades before rock musicals were the commonplace. Because in the 90s saw this huge resurgence and birth of the, like, rock and roll style musical. But in the 70s, you kind of only had Hair, which Jim Sharman, who is the director of Rocky, had worked on before, and then this, which is...
Yeah, it is very fascinating. And, I don't think not all the songs do it for me to the same degree as other songs, in part because some of the songs require ranges that, like, no human can properly achieve, which I think is part of the point. So I'm thinking of the Janet song about Touch Me, which is, like, shrilly, right? And I think it's meant to be shrilly because it's not a very erotic song, but it's in this very, quote, erotic moment. So not all the music is music that I'm gonna just listen to by itself, but as a soundtrack, and certainly as this narrative soundtrack, you really can't beat the catchiness of it, and also just the ways that it manages to put all the things it needs to put in there, right? We have all the songs that we need to have to go back to that one idea of the traditional conventional musical, but it's all being subverted, right? As one would expect.
Yeah. It started in 73, was a musical first, and the musical is basically the same plot and everything as the movie, except in this, Richard O'Brien and Jim Sharman have talked a lot about how the whole point of the stage musical was that it was film tropes parodied on the stage, and that is why it was funny. And then they talked about how it was basically like, so you've taken that, which is a parody of in itself, and then you basically don't change anything, and then you've put it up on film. And originally, before it came out, they were like, is it just too much? Is it just nothing? Have we created nothing? If we're just doing film tropes in film in a musical that is filmed? And I don't think that's the case, because I think that's actually perhaps the film aesthetic on top of these other film tropes and in this theatrical setting is part of what makes it really interesting and what works so well about the translation.
Yes, and we've talked about issues of translation particularly in our episode of Little Shop of Horrors as well, and the ways that that film, the 86 film, managed to succeed in making some important adaptations, but also to make some decisions that I think were ultimately perhaps not the best, most transgressive options. So it is interesting to hear that for Rocky Horror, they're rather faithfully translating it onto the screen, because that's not often done, for the reasons they said, right? That these are different media, and so it was a gamble, right? It's an incredible gamble to say we're going to leave it the same and hope that, or largely the same, and we're going to hope that it still manages to be as successful. So there's something inherent to the innards of Rocky Horror, independent of its manifestation, clearly, as we have the play, the shadow casting, and the film, that transcends its form. And that's very fitting for a Frankenstein-esque trans film to be transcending its form in every single possible way.
And it's really interesting that trans element that is intrinsic and cannot be taken away from the film. Obviously, I don't think anyone's really trying to separate that from the film. Is actually Richard O'Brien talked about. So O'Brien identifies as third gender, which is neither man nor woman, but it just categorizes themselves as something outside of that. Richard O'Brien talked about how that element of transvestitism wasn't intended to be a major theme in the original adaptation. And he's talked about how maybe it was just subconscious feeling about the subject coming through. He talked about that in a 1979 interview. So looking back on it, it was never intended to be as predominant. But this is one of those cases where I don't know if I'm not 100% sure if I agree with the creator and their judgment on this.
Yeah, I find it rather hard to believe that it came as a surprise to him how much people read it into the film, because it seems pretty explicit to me, right? If we take Riff Raff and Magenta as our really awkward brother sister lover unit, but if we have Riff Raff as our male alien and Magenta as our female alien, then we have a third gender, third sex character in Frank-N-Furter. So I don't know how much more explicit than that you could get.
Also, Frank's entire song about how wanting to be like Fay Wray and wear that gorgeous dress and look like and have that body type and don't dream it, be it.
Yes. In
terms of embracing the fluidity of sexuality and gender. So this is one of those. It is interesting to hear. It feels weirdly enough similar to like Nightmare 2 in terms of how the creators of that talk about it, how they're like, oh, I didn't really know, I didn't expect the gays to interpret it in this manner,
right?
But this way, and so it's interesting, but I really think that's one of the elements of the film that works so well, and is why in particular queer people have been able to identify so well into this film, around this film, and experience in them. Yeah. And
the one article in the edited collection by Weinstock that talks about the sincerity of its lust, I think you could even shorten it down to just sincerity. That there's a sincerity in this film where I'm sure you have, because I have, right, seen films where it is clear that the film, if not the actors, are uncomfortable with the portrayals that they are giving, right? Like there are a number of films, particularly films that have straight actors that are playing gay actors that are kissing, and you were like, I have seen more erotic things happening between like a grandmother's kiss with her grandchild, right? Like where it's like what they're like physically pulling away even as they're supposed to be passionately embracing. I'm like, this is clearly not of interest to this person. But in this film, everyone does such a good job of just sincerely embodying their character. There's no judgment in terms of how the film is directed or shot, and there's no judgment in terms of how the acting or the actors are. Like, you legitimately feel like in between scenes they probably were just having mass orgies. Like, you feel that in your heart because they're so willing to be ambivalent on the screen, and I didn't feel any character or actor rather gave an inauthentic performance or an insincere performance, and that's incredible. And I think that also accounts for why this film is so beloved, because it doesn't feel like it's mocking, nor does it feel like, it's hard to reappropriate Freddy too, because you're having to do it despite, the very like, no, we didn't mean that, please don't do it, but if you want to, you can. There's none of that here. This is just like, hey, want to have some fun? Because we're having some fun. And that's wildly refreshing. So tell me, when was the first time? So you watched it in the Glee, right? But like, when was the first time? What was the situation behind the first time you watched the 75 film?
So the first time around that I saw the 75 film version was actually in also less than ideal original circumstances. I saw it with my mother at our local theater in our small conservative town in Texas, and
I'm a little surprised that it was put on.
I was surprised it was put on too. This was a different kind of viewing of Rocky. It was more felt like people were making fun of it than people were like there to like enjoy the film, because you were like hearing people yell like interesting slurs, and I'm just like, it's interesting. I don't see a single queer person here, but I'm hearing a whole lot of like just slurs being hurled at the screen and people laughing at it. And again, less than ideal circumstances for my first two exposures, but in despite of it, I still was able to find it. I still liked a lot of the spirit of the participatory nature of it. I just didn't particularly enjoy how the people there were participating. It wasn't until I saw a production, I think I saw it in Austin at the longest running Rocky performance here in Texas there, that I really got into the spirit of liking the participation that was occurring.
Did you see that production with friends?
No, I saw it with my aunt. And then it wasn't until I got to college that I saw a Rocky with people who were actually my age.
Wow. Was your aunt...
My aunt was a big Rocky fan.
Okay. So I'm just trying to picture on the spectrum of family.
So
right?
She went because she loves Rocky. So that was why I was like, that was a better circumstance to go with, because that was also really nice because she brought me into the culture. I was like, oh yes, you know the lines, and so I am able to then like yell them at least a second behind you, like, or with you in support, which was really a nice way to ease in. And I know not an experience that everybody has with the call-outs and the experience of going, because I know a lot of people who just are like, at every Rocky horror screening I've been to, there's always people who leave about halfway through because they don't understand. It's clear they don't like what's going on. Or this probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone, helped produce Rocky and have run the event myself. People will come up and just be like, people are just yelling at the thing, I can't hear the movie. And you're like, well, that's just not what this is. I'm sorry, I don't know what you thought you agreed to see, but that is not what this experience is.
And there are other films that I honestly won't see in theater for the same reason. Like Princess Bride is another one that gets a lot of, it doesn't have the same call and response as Rocky Horror, but, like diehard fans are still going to nevertheless say most of the lines aloud. Or we did go and see Back to the Future, but we made sure to see it at a weird time of day. And even then, there were people that, were just like saying the lines line for line, but it doesn't have that same performative nature, right? Because that's the difference, I think, is that it's not just audience engagement, it's performance, and it is this production, this film requires us, and this comes up in the Weinstock edited collection, requires us to think differently about spectatorship, and to think that maybe that is a form of art in its own right, in a way that almost no other film is going to do, right?
I'm trying, the pause was to try to think of another film that does it quite the same way. And I think that the fact that I can't really come up with another film similar. I guess The Room, perhaps, the Tommy Wiseau film has been,
right,
and now has but that's enough. It's just cult. It's that those cult film status.
It is, and there are films that asks us to question what an audience is, and I'm thinking of a very different type of film, but like the Borat films, for example, right? Where because it is this performative, but again, it's about that performative aspect
of the audience,
and of the audience, and so maybe that's similar, but it's still not, because there's still not that call and response, there's still not that active participation, but it's just another film that queers, if you will, the audience role in the production. I think the best part about seeing this film, as opposed to seeing any stage production that I can think of, is getting to see this particular cast.
Oh my god. It's a fantastic cast here.
It is. And it's interesting to see people that have gone on to be, and I'm thinking particularly of Tim Curry and Susan Sarandon, that have gone on to be very defined in who they are in these as actors, by some other really, really well-known roles, and to see just the wild abandon that they are willing to exhibit in this film. Because I kind of think, I think of Susan Sarandon, and I don't necessarily think of this like super sort of like inhibition-free, person, but clearly she was enough, right, to be willing to be able to be in this film.
This, and then The Hunger. Years later.
So, but I just kind of think of her by some of her older roles, right? The roles that she plays when she's older, and just, it's hard. And then then there's Tim Curry, and it's like it's really hard to find someone attractive that you're like Pennywise, right? Or I think of one of his other like defining roles for me, which was much later, was he played Dale the Whale in the TV show Monk, and Dale the Whale weighed like 500 or 600 pounds, so he was in this heavy prosthetic the whole time, and he was like really, really bad guy, and so it's really, really hard to be like, you look really nice, Pennywise. So that is also, which I think again just adds this really lovely layer that there's Rocky Horror that you can experience in the early years that the film came out, and then there's Rocky Horror that you can only experience seeing the ways in which other portrayals and versions of not just Rocky Horror, but the other things the actors have been in, right? It layers on, and it makes for a different viewing experience.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of like, despite the other work that they go on to do, they are in many ways still defined and remembered as these characters, because this film has taken on, as we've suggested, just this otherworldly aspect outside of the text of the film itself. And so these characters, this experience that is recreated, you're recreating these performances from these actors and passing them on from generation to generation. So it is interesting that as like for like Tim Curry, everybody knows him from something else,
right?
But yet, in many ways, he will and always be kind of remembered as Frank. That's any interview you go with Tim Curry, he gets that question asked about Rocky Horror. And that is the same way with just about any of the creators of it. In fact, Jim Sharman is not as big of a fan of that question, who's the director, because he is actually, of all of the others, he's a serious director. He's like an established, and yet everyone just wants to talk to him about Rocky Horror anyway, which I get just speaks to that cultural power of it. And even in 2021, when we have so many other options for camp, cult films, queer films, performance opportunities, activities, things to do, we still keep returning to Rocky Horror. We still come back to this film, this experience.
Yeah. And I've always wondered, because I don't think this is a situation I will ever find myself in, but if I had this big hit, this life-changing hit, would I be upset if I, then went on to do other stuff and it never achieved the success of that first thing? Would I also be, kind of frustrated or annoyed, or would I lean into it? Like, I wonder that, because we have lots of examples. I'm like, J.K. Rowling is another good example that she's like, but I do other stuff now, and they're like, shh, Harry Potter, shh. And there's lots of people. I think Stephen King has managed to be one of the few people that, although we're like, oh, here's early works and these may be some of our favorite works, he's producing stuff that people are enjoying just as much. But those are the exceptions to the rule, right? And so there's something really interesting, and I just can't help but think about, like, what must it be like to just know that you were part of a text that has literally changed the landscape of not just one genre or not just one aspect, but as many things as possible. Like, what must that be like? What an incredibly
Jim Sharman talked about it in an interview as something he had to get over many years ago in order to keep going on, because it's just like, you could, I feel like, really get bogged down by the weight of it. Just like, nothing you do will ever be as big, which is not the only measure of success, but it is certainly a measure of success that is talked about a lot. And he just talked about it. He had to get over it to keep moving on, and to appreciate that this was coming out of not a dislove of all of the other stuff, but of so much love for this one other thing.
And you say big, and I think that's key, because it's not just that it's now a financial success. It's not just that it's a pop culture success, or that it's a transmedial success. It's that it's a queer success. It's that it's all of these, right? And so there are other texts that you can be like, well, this made a lot of money, but the critical reception wasn't very good. But like with Rocky Horror, you can't say any of that. And I think that's lovely, because this is a Frankenstein text. And so the at the core, if we go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, at the core of that is, have I made a mistake in creating something that now has autonomy and agency beyond me, the creator? And we see that with Frank-N-Furter and Rocky, and we see that with just the way that Frank-N-Furter's like, you're mine, and Rocky's like, am I?
Yeah.
And just even the titling, right? Calling it the Rocky Horror Picture Show, as opposed to the, if we're going back to the Frankenstein narrative, right? Frankenstein is the doctor. It's named after the doctor. This is named after the creature. So there's ways in which it's so amazing. Like, what are the odds that you couldn't have made this happen intentionally, that the text becomes itself the creature that we are taught to both fear and love?
And that creature is truly more powerful than just about anything else. It's the only thing perhaps more powerful than Disney right now, because of the world we live in. Fox, which made Rocky Horror, which also insane that a major studio
it really is. That was my thought 70s. The entire time that I was watching it. It was like, it's so, I feel like this film would struggle to get me made today, and clearly it did, because you're talking about how the made-for-TV version took things out, right? They censored themselves, which again is sort of the opposite of camp.
They had to. And it still took years to be developed, because it had to go through so many levels of, will it work? Can we do it? Will this be on? Because Fox was meant to do it on their television network, it had to be okay for television now, which is a new thing on top of it.
And so we have that, right? We have we can barely do it today. And the fact that it is coming out from a major distributor is so amazing. And I just don't know how that's possible. But yay.
And so it was produced by Fox, and then Fox got bought by Disney, and so now Rocky Horror is technically under the domain of Disney. And Disney, there was this big scare when that happened, because Disney has notoriously pulled distribution rights for its films to put its films behind the vault, in the Disney vault. And they immediately started doing this with Fox films. Alien pulled from screenings. You can't do think of a Fox property, they've pulled it. Except for Rocky Horror. They did not touch it. Rocky Horror, I can't believe we hadn't mentioned this at all, has still not been left theater circulation since it premiered in 1975. It's the longest running film, continually running film of all time.
That's amazing.
And there was the real possibility, people were afraid that when Disney bought it, they would shut down these productions of Rocky, because it doesn't make sense from a corporate perspective to let these happen. Because it really only benefits the people and who see Rocky. Right. It doesn't benefit them in any way who technically now own it. But I think even Disney realized that they may own Rocky, but they don't own Rocky. That still belongs to the fans and the project itself, which, as you said, from the Frankenstein narrative, has taken on a life unto itself and can't really be controlled or owned.
And I would like to stress again just how incredible it is that they haven't taken it away, because they are in the process with their new, I can't remember if he's their CIO or CEO or one of the CEOs, probably CEO, who has been making all of these changes to how Disneyland and Disney World work in terms of charging more for things that no one asked for, right? But they're like, but we can make more money on this, and we think we can get the people to keep paying. So they are such a mercenary system when it comes to everything, that it just really is amazing. And I don't know if it's because they did the math and they figured out, the number of instances in which they just constantly be fighting battles, or if I find it hard to believe that any shadowy corporation was feeling generous, because I don't think that's how shadowy corporations work. But it is this, again, really sort of interesting level. The one other thing I do want to say about the film, because in our spooky scraps we'll talk a little bit more about the theatrical thing, is that having seen the play first and seeing it in a smaller theater with a smaller budget, I really appreciated the mise en scène, particularly the set designs, and I almost feel like you can't fully understand the like majesty that is this film if you can't see it where we can have an entire room that's pink, except for the rainbow colored tank, or some of the cuts that we absolutely need that you can kind of mimic on stage, but it's harder. Like, for example, when Frank-N-Furter is visiting Janet and then Brad in the slightly rapey but also very funny, and then I feel awkward saying that, scenes, but like, we need it to be able to cut like that. And so there are things that I think make the film in some ways a superior version of the excess than you can have on a stage. And I don't know if you disagree, because you've seen more stage productions than I have. But
I think that is true, and I think that the creators would even agree with you too. They talked about how they were hoping to achieve more of a surrealist, extravagant feel for the film, whereas the stage version is a more intimate rock and roll, punk in your face aesthetic. And so they're just two completely different things. And I don't know which one I prefer. I think they're just two entirely different creatures, two entirely different Frankenstein creatures, if you will. And so I think it just depends on whatever I'm in the mood for.
I think I need to see, I would like to see the play. I don't know if I'm particularly interested in the shadow casting, for whatever that's worth. But I think I would like to see the play again, now that I know that I won't have like that trauma of being the newbie that's like, what We actually have lines that we're supposed to deliver. And now that I've seen the film, I want to see the play again, because I think I would be able to make a better assessment. But I just, the film is so, it's like velvet, right? And I don't always like the touch of velvet as like a human. It's not my favorite feel. But at the same time, there's sometimes that you're like, ooh, this feels nice. And you're like, oh, does it? Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. And that's what the film offers you in a way that I just don't know if anything else can compare. If you're listening to this episode when it releases, this was something that we sort of added onto our normal rotation of films because we were that excited to just do some more spooky season fun.
And also maybe give you a podcast to listen to about Rocky Horror while you either go to see it this weekend or after you see it this Halloween weekend.
Yes, because apparently, which weekend did you say it is that everyone sees?
It's this weekend. So today, when this episode gets released, will be the 29th. So the weekend before Halloween is the most popular weekend for Rocky performances.
Excellent. But fortunately, spooky season is not ending with our discussion of Rocky Horror.
No. We will be doing our annual tradition where we watch a film from the Halloween franchise, and we have our age-old conversation where I dislike it and Dr. Troyer loves it.
Yeah, basically it's where I'm sad because I'm like, but don't you like this a little? And then Anthony's like, actually, my love for it grows less every time. And I'm like, but how is that? So you need to listen to that episode because it is...
Because we're going to be...
Yeah.
It's a classic. Halloween Kills 2021. We're going to talk about the new one. That'll come out on Halloween, so... get excited for that.
And if people want to get a hold of us, how would they do so?
They can follow us on our social medias, which are in the description of this podcast. Wherever you get your podcast from, why don't you go ahead and give us a rating there? Anything you can leave us, just leave us a 5-star rating where you get your podcast.
That's very presumptuous.
Helpful.
You're like, leave us a 5-star, not leave us a rating. Leave us a 5-star rating is what Anthony's telling you to do.
In an era of only dualistic binary reactions to things, I want you to have a good positive 5-star reaction to this podcast rather than the alternative in this scenario. So go give us a rating there. Our email is also in here if you want to get in touch and email us suggestions for what we should do on future episodes.
And we want to thank you for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.